Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Guillermo Ruiz.
Hello everyone and welcome to the show. If you're listening to the show on February 28th, today is my birthday and I wanted to do something special for my birthday. I wanted to give you a gift. So I reached out to one of my friends, Chris Masterjohn, and we had an interview on something that is going to be a little bit more actionable for you. We discussed fats and all of the different intricacies that can come into selecting the right fat for the right purpose. Chris earned his PhD in Nutritional Science from the University of Connecticut in the summer of 2012. From 2012 to 2014, he served as a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Illinois. And then he served as the assistant professor of health and nutrition sciences at Brooklyn College, part of the University of New York. Then in 2016, Chris had a change of heart. He decided to leave academia and pursue entrepreneurship. He currently conducts independent research, consulting, working on information products, collaborating on information technology, and producing tons of free content to help people gain better health. If you enjoyed this show, you can go to iTunes and leave me a review. So without further ado, here's Chris Masterjohn. Hey Chris, how you doing, man?
Doing awesome, Guillermo. Thanks for having me on.
Oh man, thanks for coming on such a short notice, man. You know, it's really cool that that we can talk, and that's one of the coolest things about being on a smaller community like the paleo community, that you really get to connect with other practitioners and other awesome people and really bring this information out to the masses.
For sure, man.
So, I had a patient a couple of weeks ago, and I printed out a shopping list and a little rubric that I made, to help simplify how to make recipes, and handed it to her. She came back a couple of weeks later and she was very confused because she didn't know what cooking oils or cooking fats were. So we take it for granted because we have been.
So you mean the question of what cooking oils you should use didn't make any sense?
Yeah.
Because what's a cooking oil?
Basically, she was like, "What do you mean by cooking oil and cooking fat?" So we take it for granted because we've been at this game for so long that, so let's start there, okay? Let's start in a very macroscopical level. Why shouldn't we be using seed oil? And what's seed oil?
Well, this itself can get kind of confusing because there's a lot of scientific terms for the foods we eat that are different from the intuitive terms that we use. So taxonomically, meaning in the science of how you classify different plants and components of plants, a seed is anything that you can plant in the ground and grow it. But I think if you say seed oil to someone, I mean, first of all, they're probably not even familiar with the term seed oil, but if they think seed, they think pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds and things like that. They're not going to think of nuts. They're not going to think of soybeans, because soybeans are beans, and so on, right? Right, but I mean, in the mind, like, that person's probably going to be, what's a legume?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So in science, we'll call all of these, or to take another example, is the tomato, is it a fruit or a vegetable? And this became a famous question in the Reagan administration when they made it so that ketchup would count towards the vegetable allotment for school meals. And one of the criticisms of this, I mean, one of them was that ketchup's full of sugar and that's not really the nutritional value of a vegetable. But also one of the criticisms was actually tomato is a fruit, not a vegetable. And tomato is a fruit from a scientific perspective because you see that there are seeds inside of it, and the tomato is the flesh that's grown around those seeds. That's what a fruit is. But to the person who's thinking about their diet, what a fruit is a watermelon or an orange or a grapefruit, and what a vegetable is a carrot or a tomato or a celery. And so we often not only can fail to communicate this, but we can get kind of snobby about it. I remember I was at a conference once at Tufts University, and I was hanging out. I wasn't a graduate student yet. I was hanging out with some Tufts graduate students, and we were making fun of people who think that tomatoes are vegetables when they're really fruits. And this professor came over and corrected us and said, taxonomically, tomatoes are fruits, but culinarily, tomatoes are vegetables.
Oh, there you go.
And we were like, oh, burn. So anyway, when we use the term seed oils, we are really talking about anything that you could plant in the ground and it would sprout and grow something else. That's a seed. And the reason that those oils are distinct is because a seed is metabolically dormant, and the seed is able to accumulate a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are so if you think about seed oils, they're the oils that you would find liquid, and they're the oils that even if you put them in the refrigerator, they tend to still be liquid. So for example, olive oil is probably going to be liquid at room temperature, but it's going to harden pretty well in the refrigerator. If we think about corn oil or sunflower oil, safflower oil, soybean oil, canola oil, all of these are seed oils, and they're much more liquid to the point where they can get pretty cold and stay liquid. Well, a seed, because it is essentially waiting to become metabolically active after it's planted in the ground and after it sprouts, it is able to accumulate a lot of fatty acids that we call polyunsaturated fatty acids. These are the same fatty acids that make that oil very, very liquid. And those fatty acids tend to also be very vulnerable to a process called oxidation, which is kind of like chemically, like if you left your bicycle out in the rain and it rusts, that's oxidation. On a chemical level, it's the same when an oil oxidizes, but it doesn't produce rust. So chemically they're the same, but they're, the way that we would think about them, if you leave the oil on the counter, you're not going to see it rusting. But if you leave it out for long enough, it's probably not going to smell very good and it's going to go rancid. So that's oxidative damage that's happening to the oil. And that can even happen inside our own bodies. So it's sort of like a biological form of rust is happening inside our bodies. And the seeds, because they are not metabolically active, they don't produce a lot of the byproducts of metabolism that could damage those fatty acids, and so they don't have as much protection for them. So if you look at one of the most important molecules to try to protect those polyunsaturated fatty acids, vitamin E is very important. And yes, seeds have a lot of vitamin E, but when you look at the amount of vitamin E compared to the amount of polyunsaturated fat they have, it's actually really low compared to simple things like leaves. Like if you're thinking of like lettuce, for example, lettuce has way more vitamin E relative to the amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids it has compared to these seeds that we make oils out of. And so the reason that we want to be concerned about them is because if we're consuming a real high amount or we're cooking with them, we may have too much risk of damage to the fatty acids and not enough protection.
And to make a very extreme example of this, you can take linseed oil and you can just wet some rags with linseed oil, which is highly polyunsaturated, and you can just leave it, and it's spontaneously combust. And I know this because when I was an EMT, a lot of the EMT people go into the fire academy, and that was like an exam question. If you see an explosion that you see some rags and they were in a woodworking shop, it probably was linseed oil that combusted. So the oxidation is so high, and you can find some videos on YouTube of people just combusting linseed oil out of nowhere. So the more polyunsaturated the fatty acid is, the more prone to oxidation. Am I right?
Simply put, if you eat flax seeds, you will catch on fire.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, combust.
Gotta make this real simple for folks.
Yeah. Okay. So But Chris, what about omega-3 fatty acids? They're highly polyunsaturated. Should I be eating more polyunsaturated fatty acids if they're omega-3? If they're omega-3, they should be good for me, shouldn't they?
Well, there's a very real concern, which is that as our diets have evolved over the course of the 20th century, we have started to eat a lot more omega-6 and started to lose valuable sources of omega-3 in the diet. Now, that doesn't mean that more omega-3 is better. It's still the case that these fatty acids are very vulnerable to oxidative damage, so we don't want to overconsume them. However, we do want to cut back on the vegetable oils that are supplying so much omega-6, and we do want to eat some omega-3. I think a great way to do that is just to include some fish in the diet. Simply doing that is going to provide a lot of omega-3. Sure, you can use flaxseed oil, but I wouldn't make it the major food oil that you're using. I think it's really easy for us to assume that because something is good, more of it is good. And with omega-3 fatty acids, that's not really the case.
Well, it's funny because back when I first started doing the paleo thing, I would supplement with fish oil. And if I had like a fried food for dinner, like if I went to and had some fries, at the end of the day, I would just try to counterbalance by eating more fish oil because I thought, the most important thing is the balance of omega-3 to omega-6s. So if I had a high omega-6, if I up my omega-3...
Tell all your listeners, don't try this at home.
Do not try this at home because it is about the balance. But by consuming higher amounts of omega-3 fatty acids and higher amounts of omega-6 fatty acids, now your potential for oxidation is exponential.
Well, no, it's worse than that. I mean, when you're eating French fries, it's not just that you have omega-6, it's also that omega-6 was probably in that fryer for a week, and your fries were the 367th thing fried in that oil. And so it's full of all kinds of oxidation products that can cause the oxidative damage in the first place. So you're basically consuming the most vulnerable fats on top of consuming the things that are going to cause harm to those fats. And you're trying to make up for that by consuming even more of these vulnerable fats.
Yes. But that's that's about 8 years ago, and my understanding has evolved. But looking back, man, I was doing some pretty crazy stuff. Okay, so don't eat seed oils or try to minimize your consumption of seed oils. But what about things that are not, like avocado oil or like you mentioned, olive oil?
If you look at olive oil or avocado oil, they're both pretty high in monounsaturated fatty acids, and they're going to have more polyunsaturated fat than, say, something like a traditional animal fat would. Although to some degree it depends. Like olive oil and lard have pretty similar amount of polyunsaturated fat. If you compare it to something like tallow or duck fat or something like that, you'll have more polyunsaturated fat in those oils, but for the most part, I would say they're monounsaturated. But the thing you have to keep in mind is that, first of all, let's say you take something like olive oil. It's probably going to be about 10% polyunsaturated. And so if you just eat gobs and gobs of it, that 10% is going to build up after a while. But also, you have to keep in mind that whatever you eat, there's, to borrow a term from economics, there's an opportunity cost to that, meaning the harm of eating foods isn't just that there might be something bad about that food. It's that every time you eat something, that's something else you couldn't eat instead. So if you just if you make it your reason for being to eat as much olive oil as you can, eventually you're going to be displacing really valuable other foods in the diet. And there's lots of cool things about olive oil from a health perspective, but it's not that high in essential nutrients. It's got hardly any essential nutrients in it.
So we've gone from polyunsaturated fatty acids to monounsaturated fatty acids. So the logical step would be to talk a little bit about saturated fatty acids. Now,
Sure.
When I was talking about cooking oils and cooking fats, one of the easiest modifications to your diet that you can do is switch from a corn or seed oil to something like coconut oil. Because you're not losing that much in taste. It's just a replacement at that point. You're not doing something very drastic that is going to end up having a lot of good repercussions towards your health. Should we, when we're cooking when we're selecting a cooking oil or cooking fat, okay, should we go for a monounsaturated like avocado oil or olive oil? This is something like for cooking that you're gonna keep on your counter, or should we go for a saturated fat like tallow, like coconut oil? And then if we're selecting something like coconut oil, should we get a refined coconut oil, but refined has a bad stigma to it, or unrefined, but I don't like the taste of coconut? What should we do?
There's basically three things that you want to be concerned about. One is that no matter what fat you use, really high heat damages foods in ways that's not good for your health. So using the proper fat isn't a license to eat an unlimited amount of deep fried food. So you want to be moderating the temperature anyway, and you want to be using a lot of gently cooked food and a good amount of raw food in your diet, and things that are heated to great extents, especially deep fried food, you want to keep in moderation. The next thing to consider is, okay, say you're going to saute or deep fry or what have you. How do you choose your cooking oil? And when you're looking, it's not just limited to the fatty acid composition. When you are looking at the oil, you also want to consider the smoke point. And the smoke point basically means at what point does the oil start burning? And that's usually not a function of the fatty acids. It's usually a function of other things that are in the oil that are minor constituents that are capable of burning at the temperatures that you would cook at. And usually the more refined the oil is, the higher the smoke point, meaning the higher the temperature you can use before you start burning it. A good example of this is to look at butter versus ghee. It's super easy to burn butter in a pan. Even if let's say you wanted to cook eggs in a pan, you could spread some butter in that pan and heat it up. If you leave it on for too long before you put your eggs in, you're going to look at it and you're going to see brown stuff because all the milk solids started caramelizing and maybe even burning. You might even see it smoking. And if you do the same thing with ghee, you're much more able to get away with using a higher temperature or cooking it for longer. And that's because the ghee you've removed all the milk solids, and those are the things that's burning in the oil. So if you take something like coconut oil, the refined coconut oil is more stable at higher temperatures because you've removed those other things that are capable of burning. So if I'm looking at coconut oil, it's not about which one is good. It's about what are you going to do with it. So if you're going to spread coconut oil on bread, or I don't know what you paleo folks eat. If you're going to blend coconut oil into your coffee, you're not blasting it with lots of heat. And so if you include unrefined oil in that case, or let's say you're spreading it on a food, or even if you're gently cooking in a pan so that you're using really low heat.
Like in the case of a curry, like I usually use unrefined coconut oil just to get a little bit of coconut flavor on my curries.
Right. Anything where the heat is like less than medium on a stovetop, for example, you can get away with including the unrefined coconut oil because it's not going to burn, and the substances are actually good for you. Those are things that enhance the flavor and also enhance the health benefits. But if you're frying in the coconut oil and it's smoking, not only are those substances not good for you anymore because you've burned them, but now that you've burned them, they're bad for you because it's bad to eat burned stuff. So in that case, there's no harm in using the refined coconut oil. All you've done is removed the stuff that you weren't going to get any benefit from anyway, and instead you're removing that harm. Now, if you're looking at the fatty acids, then the biggest concern is you want to reduce the polyunsaturated fatty acids because they're much more the difference between polyunsaturated and the other two classes is much bigger than the difference between monounsaturated and saturated. Out of those, saturated is a little bit more saturated and long chain is going to make the fat more stable. So something like tallow is going to be more stable than coconut oil, and something or more stable than olive oil. But you're getting to relatively small differences here, and even saturated fats, if the temperature is high enough, can oxidize. At the temperature inside our bodies, saturated fats and monounsaturated fats are immune to oxidation, and only polyunsaturated fats are relevant. But if you're deep frying, that temperature is actually high enough that you can oxidize any of the fatty acids.
Basically, just if you're sauteing something, like if you're making a stir fry, try using refined coconut oil. If you're adding it for flavor, or if you are using it to lightly cook maybe an over easy egg, maybe you can get away with using unrefined coconut oil. Then same with butter, and then ghee has a higher smoking point because you've taken the milk solids out of the butter.
That's a just good intuitive principle. You can also just Google smoke points of oils, and you'll probably a top thing will be a list of the different smoke points of oils, so you can get a better handle on it if you want further reading. And you can also just pay attention to what's happening in your food. It's called the smoke point because it smokes. So you can get a very, if you're doing something slightly wrong, you can get a very quick sense just by paying attention to whether your food is smoking and whether the oils you're using are burning.
Yeah, and especially with like coconut oil, it's so distinct that the smell of burning coconut oil, it smells like a city movie theater.
Yep. Don't try this at home, folks.
Don't go smoke up some coconut oil. Now, we talked a little bit about the importance of vitamins within the oil to preserve it. So vitamin A, vitamin E. So is that the reason they're adding these vitamins to polyunsaturated fatty acids? And are they sufficient for them to not oxidize when you consume them?
What do you mean by they adding?
Is the amount of vitamin E in seed oils enough to prevent oxidation when you consume them? That's the question.
I gotcha. So if you take something like, let's say, corn oil, and you compare it to something like olive oil, corn oil has an enormously greater amount of vitamin E if you're talking about per unit volume or mass of that oil, like per tablespoon. There's way more vitamin E in corn oil. If you look at the vitamin E to PUFA ratio, PUFA is an abbreviation for polyunsaturated fatty acids, the ones that are vulnerable. Corn oil doesn't look so hot when you compare it to other oils. And so what that means is that you're getting more vitamin E, but you're not getting more vitamin E relative to the PUFA. Now, the reason that corn oil has more vitamin E is to protect those PUFA. But you have to think about, is the corn kernel thinking about you, or is the corn kernel thinking about itself? Or is the kernel not really thinking about this? It turns out, as a great surprise to all of the scientists who studied this, it turned out that, to our surprise, corn kernels don't think about anything. But nevertheless, the corn was subject to evolutionary pressure to protect the polyunsaturated fatty acids in the corn kernel for the survival of the corn species, and there was no pressure on the corn to make it healthy for humans to eat the corn, right? So what that means is, how much vitamin E do you need to protect the corn kernel? Well, the corn kernel, until it sprouts and grows into a corn plant, is metabolically dormant for the most part. It's not really doing anything. It's not burning energy. It's not photosynthesizing. And so the amount of vitamin E is able to protect that polyunsaturated fatty acid load against the normal exposures that corn kernel will have in the environment. And those are much more moderate than they have inside our bodies, because we are metabolizing. We're consuming lots of oxygen and engaging in metabolism and generating all these byproducts of metabolism that are the very things that can hurt those fatty acids. So once that corn oil or corn kernel is entering our body, suddenly we need to rely on our own defenses instead of what the corn plant was providing. So if you're not heating the oil, then that oil is probably going to be very safe between when you spoon it out into your spoon and you guzzle it down. I don't know, you'd probably have to chase it with tomato juice or orange juice or something like that. But if you were to pour a spoonful out and consume it without heating it, there's pretty much no risk that there's oxidative damage to those oils during that process. But if you eat a lot of, even if you were to eat corn oil in that way and you were to eat a lot of it over time, what's going to happen is that your own tissues are going to become saturated with those polyunsaturated fatty acids. And now the burden is now on you to find vitamin E to protect them. And so what that means is that over time, they're raising your vitamin E requirement more than the vitamin E that they're supplying in the seed itself or in the oil. And the long-term consequence after consuming them for about 4 years is that you're going to have worse vitamin E status than someone else who wasn't consuming the corn oil over that same time period. So even though they contain more vitamin E, it's a net drag on your vitamin E status over time.
So then you arrive to a crossroads, and as the way we think in this society, we have this crossroads, and we would go into, okay, so I'll start consuming corn oil with added vitamin E, with an exogenous formulation from some supplement company of vitamin E. When in reality, the choice can be very simple. Just don't use seed oils and start using lard, butter, coconut oil, and then you're protecting yourself.
That's brilliant, Guillermo.
So now, let me ask you this. What about things like palm oil or cod liver oil? Why are those so healthy for you?
For totally different reasons. So first of all, palm oil in the unrefined state, so virgin red palm oil, is very rich in nutrients. So it's very rich in carotenoids, for example, which are the precursors to retinol. Together, we classify that as vitamin A. And there are genetic differences in our abilities to get vitamin A from plant foods, so it's not going to be equally reliable source for everyone. However, it provides those carotenoids in a very easily digestible form. And they're actually much more bioavailable when you consume palm oil than if you're going to eat raw carrots on a salad, for example, where you may have equal amounts of carotenoids, but they're nowhere near as digestible because there's so much work that your digestive system has to do to separate it from everything else in the carrot. So when you consume palm oil, all these nutrients, including the carotenoids, are in their most bioavailable form, because it's like what you need to do when you eat a carrot is take other fat in your diet, break down the carrot, separate the fibrous matrix, separate all these components, and then mix together the vitamins, the fat-soluble vitamins, into the other fats that you ate in the diet, and then swirl them together with your digestive enzymes, and then it's ready for you to absorb it. You eat palm oil, all that's already done for you, right? So you have very digestible carotenoids in palm oil, and you also have a very wide spectrum of different forms of vitamin E at a very high concentration. And if you look at the vitamin E to PUFA ratio in palm oil, it's actually really high, higher than in any other food oil. So both from a vitamin E perspective and from a carotenoid perspective, palm oil is very nutritious. Now, switch gears to cod liver oil, and the story is a little bit different. So cod liver oil is very rich in omega-3 fatty acids and in vitamin A and in vitamin D. And if you consider the issue about carotenoid conversion, well, for anyone, palm oil is going to be better than carrots for vitamin A. But if you compare palm oil to cod liver oil, someone who's, for genetic reasons or other health reasons, isn't very good at converting carotenoids into retinol, the physiologically essential form of vitamin A, cod liver oil is going to be a much more reliable source of vitamin A for that person because it supplies retinol in that final form. You don't need to do any work to convert anything to get the vitamin A from cod liver oil. And it's also dissolved in an oil already. So like palm oil, it's very digestible and easy to absorb. So cod liver oil is not that great a source of vitamin E, but it's a very good source of vitamin A and vitamin D and omega-3 fatty acids. And the vitamin A is in a more digestible form. So all these strengths, palm oil doesn't really have them. But palm oil has its own set of strengths as well.
And I want to point out that all of these different forms of fatty acids that we've talked about are traditional forms of cooking oils and cooking fats that we've used. And then you can go into supplementation with cod liver oil and palm oil. And those are actually food products. They're not supplements. So it's like we traditionally have been using this and they have been keeping us healthy. So it's to me, it's really cool how we can look at tradition and find the right supplements for us.
I mean, in a sense, I think cod liver oil is kind of a supplement. It's
Yeah,
it's somewhat removed from eating the whole fish or eating a fish liver, but also has this, because it's traditional, it has this extensive track record of safe use over time. And one of the things that, even when our ancestors were trying to make a supplement, their ability to separate out one thing from all the other components was very limited. Kind of like the same thing is true of our hunter-gatherer ancestors would often go through a lot of effort to make their food more palatable. But their version of making the food more palatable wasn't anywhere near what we've accomplished with ice cream and cookies and chips
Doritos.
and all these. Right. So supplements that we were using traditionally, not only do we have what we don't have maybe is lots of randomized controlled trials testing their effects or something like that, because their use largely predated the development of that type of science. But what we do have is a really long track record of safe use in the human diet. And we can go back and look at cod liver oil and say, well, we have lots of science about what vitamin A does and what vitamin D does and what they do in combination and what they do separately. And one of the things that we see is over and over again, we see this is different substances in the diet have so many interactions that it's always safer, or that it's usually safer and often much more effective to use them in the combinations where we're placing equal emphasis on all of them than to use them in isolation. And there may be some very specific exceptions to that rule. Like you may find that someone has a genetic mutation in the metabolism of a certain nutrient, and you need to megadose that nutrient in that person specifically. But those are rare exceptions to the rule that the components of our diet work together. And our ancestors, because they had limitations on their ability to refine the foods, they were naturally put in the position that when they were trying to supplement, they were much more likely to combine them in the proportions where they're going to be safe and effective. We are much more likely to get obsessed with a certain particular component, isolate it or synthesize it, and then megadose it without paying any attention to the other components that need to work together with it.
And this is very important for my listeners. Just think about it this way. Cod liver oil is not going to have 10,000 IUs of vitamin D. It's not going to have high levels of vitamin E. It's not going to have high levels of vitamin A. But even at the lower levels, they're going to be more easily assimilated by your body because our body has the mechanisms to absorb it. And it trumps eating a supplement that has a higher level of each one of those constituents, because the physiology usually trumps whatever we're trying to override.
Yeah, I don't know that they're always going to be more easily absorbed. Sometimes supplements can be very easily absorbed, even if they're synthetic. And if you take a case like someone who has fat malabsorption, you can actually make fat-soluble vitamins more absorbable to them by modifying them to be water-soluble. So I don't think it's really about the absorbability. I really think it's more about the way that they're working together with one another. And it's not the case that we can't improve on something that our ancestors did, but it's definitely the case that if we don't have a highly specific reason to do so, and if we don't really, really, really know what we're doing, then we're a lot more likely to get ourselves in trouble trying to mess with things than we are if we do what we know has a good track record. So when I think of cod liver oil, I don't think of it as, oh, I need a lower dose because it's more absorbable. I think about it more along the lines of, well, we don't have centuries of use of vitamin A supplements. We do have at least centuries of use of cod liver oil. We have thousands of use of cod livers. We have millions of use of livers, right? So we know that the components and the way that they're arranged there are compatible with human health, that we have traditions around pursuing them, and we don't know what we don't know, right? So if you were working with a patient where you did know that there's some profoundly, there's some mutation in some gene that makes this person have an extremely rare error of metabolism of vitamin A that makes them need 10 times the normal amount or something, then so much that you can say that you can estimate the risk and benefit of using an isolated supplement. If you're just trying to be healthy, then you don't have a compelling justification to do something like that. And you don't know, right? You don't have that much knowledge. And so it makes much more sense to fall back on what we have an established track record of for something like cod liver oil than to start messing around with the balance of nutrients in our diet for no good reason at all.
Beautifully said. So Chris, we're running out of time. And I'm very excited about all the work that you're doing. When I interviewed you back in December, you said that you were going to come in furious with a bunch of information, and you've delivered. Your zinc write-up, fantastic. I'm trying to get the medicinary at the school to carry the zinc that you recommend. Your glutathione podcast, fantastic. I'm about to go listen to the Iron Overload, and I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. Where can people find this information?
Sure. Well, the center home of everything I do is chrismasterjohnphd.com. You can go there and you can find my podcast. You can find my blog. You can find Masterclass with Masterjohn, which is a series of YouTube videos going in depth on how, right now it's about how the antioxidant system works. That's for the people who want something really sciencey. You can get Chris Masterjohn Lite, that's Lite. That's 2 days a week. I put out on YouTube and Facebook 2 or 3, or actually usually it's 3 to 5 minute videos, just about a quick tip that is, mostly about the practical nature with just enough why to make it make sense. And so all of those things can be found directly on my website. So that's chrismasterjohnphd.com is really the place where you can find everything. Of course, I'm on YouTube and Facebook. That's where the videos come out. I'm in whatever your favorite podcast app is. That's where the podcast comes out. And I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat if you're into the social media thing.
Are you in Musical.ly?
I'm not on Musical.ly.
Why?
Because I'm not a 14-year-old girl.
Well, man, it's been a pleasure. I know you gotta go talk to some clients, and dude, it's such a great conversation. I hope to have you back.
For sure, man.
And maybe we can talk about infections and high dose vitamin A.
Hope to be back, man. Sounds awesome.
Cool, man. Talk to you later.
Peace out. Bye.
Bye.